On this channel, I've always said that no video game is truly perfect. And while this statement sounds great on the surface, there's some games out there that are so good that they honestly make me rethink my opinion, let alone the fact that there's also games that just don't have any noticeable issues at all, and thus, you could call them perfect. Today I want to go over some games that I think could be basically flawless. That doesn't mean they're truly without flaws, it just means they're so incredibly close that they might as well be. Here's some ground rules so that we're on the same page. Also, if you have any suggestions for games that belong in this video, let me know in the comments, and I'll reply with my thoughts. And with that, let's begin. Let's start with one of the best-selling games of all time, Tetris. Now, as you can see from this footage, I've completely forgotten how to play Tetris. And you might be saying, how the hell do you forget to play Tetris? It's Tetris. I really don't have a good reason other than it's just been so long. Now, this is a puzzle game, so the question is, does it have any issues? Not really. I mean, with games like these, they're so incredibly simple yet still so fun. So it's almost impossible to mess them up with bad mechanics. So is Tetris technically perfect? It might be. You'll have to let me know what you think down below. Here we have another puzzle game, yet this one is a lot more advanced. Portal is a unanimously loved puzzle game from 2007, with its simple yet so addicting mechanic of creating interdimensional portals to progress to the next room. I finally got to play this game earlier this year and I beat the whole thing in one sitting. I've never really been a huge fan of puzzles until games like this. There's just absolutely nothing bad about the game. Sure, it's not a very long game, but I prefer it that way. I think it's cool to see what they can do with a 3 to 4 hour time frame. It's definitely easier to make shorter games perfect though, because there's less mechanics in the game that can end up being badly designed. So is Portal a perfect game? Let me know. Next we have Super Mario Bros. 3, a game that was once upon a time considered the greatest game ever. But that was 30 years ago now. Does it still hold up as a masterpiece? In my opinion, yes. Especially if you're playing the All-Stars version or the Game Boy Advance version. The game introduced so many key features that we now know from this franchise. World maps, Koopalings, airship levels. I mean, you don't need me to tell you it's an iconic game. A lot of people prefer Super Mario World, and I definitely can't blame you, as we'll talk about that one later. I think Mario Bros. 3 is for sure the greatest NES game of all time, but is it a perfect game? I could definitely see there being a couple nitpicky issues about this game, whether you don't like a few of the levels or the minigames are annoying to you. I'd love to hear what you think. Moving on to another 2D platformer, but this time from the Super Nintendo, Donkey Kong Country. I finally got to play through my mom's childhood game. As somebody who grew up with the newer Donkey Kong games, I absolutely love this one as well. The difficulty balance in this original game is phenomenal. It just feels like it has a perfect difficulty curve as you get deeper into the game. I also think the graphics are incredible, not just for the Super Nintendo, but even nowadays. It's just so fun to look at. These early 3D renders are just so pleasant and charming. The game had breathtaking graphics for its time, and fun and unique graphics for today. You could also play the game with 2 players, although only one player can control the game at a time. And the soundtrack, don't even get me started. Some of the best atmospheric tracks in any platformer. Anyway, there are a few nitpicky issues I have with this game. First is the bosses are average at best, a lot of them being straight up bad. Second is that after you beat a boss and move on to the next area, you might not be able to save your game until you beat a few more levels and unlock the save point for that area. Some people see this as a good challenge. I saw it as tedious artificial difficulty. You should be able to save after each level. That's what beating the level means. You beat it. You should be able to move on. And the reason I didn't criticize Mario Bros. 3 for this is that I'm not too sure they were able to do this on NES hardware, whereas the Super Nintendo could absolutely do this. Anyway, we spent a lot of time on this one, so let's move on. Now look, there may be some bias in this pick because this is my favorite game of all time, but Red Dead Redemption is as amazing as video games get. I've played through this game at least 6 times, played through the DLC twice. I just love it more and more every time I pick it up again. You play as John Marston, a former outlaw looking to pay the government back for his past sins, and he does this by hunting down his former friends. In this game, you'll experience shootouts, horse racing, duels, all the Wild West cliches. If there's one thing to criticize, it's the difficulty being pretty easy, but there is actually a harder difficulty which is honestly much more balanced, but I still think the normal mode is fine. The world map isn't as big as it is in the second game, but it's still my preference because it includes my favorite area of the game, Mexico. Atmospheric music is also a huge reason why this game's open world is so great. With its good storytelling, great gameplay, and great side content, there's not too much this game fails at. Let me know if you've played Red Dead Redemption, and what are some things you don't like about the game. When Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door finally released on Nintendo Switch this year, it was my first time beating a game from this series, and even though I've never really been a fan of the series before this, the game blew me away with how unnecessarily flawless it felt. It's definitely the game you should play first if you're looking to get into this series, because from what I've heard, it's the best one. I don't think it'll ever be one of my personal favorite RPGs, but if we're being as objective as possible about the game, there's basically nothing I can criticize it for, but that won't stop me from trying. You see, the game has a bit of a slow start, but guess what? The same thing can be said for almost every single role-playing game ever made. It's not even really an objectively bad start of the game either. It's just not as stimulating as the rest of it, and that's to be expected. I don't have anything else to critique. The combat's great, the art style's great, the characters are great, the music is great. It's an awesome RPG and one you should play. Is it a perfect game? It's definitely possible, and I don't really have any complaints about it. Next, we have Metroid Prime. And look, it's been over a year since I began my playthrough of this game, so I don't remember everything about it. I remember having to look up a ton of walkthroughs for the game because at the time, I hadn't played through a ton of retro games, so I guess I was just used to how modern games hold your hand constantly. The game is a masterpiece though. Throughout my playthrough, I did not encounter a single area of the game that I considered to be badly designed. Even in some of the areas where I was getting stuck or kept having to backtrack or didn't know what to do at a boss fight, it was my own fault. This is arguably the most immersive video game ever made, and that's saying a lot with the types of games we have nowadays. Its world is simply breathtaking, especially for the time. I mean, this is natively a GameCube game, and it still looks better than most Nintendo Switch games. It's a damn shame Metroid games never sell well. They deserve so much better. Let's talk about a game you might have not expected to be on this list. It's a game that's bundled in with every PlayStation 5 console, Astro's Playroom. If you have a PlayStation 5, you've probably given this game a try, as it comes without cost. And if you've only played a few minutes of it, you might just think it's a silly little tech demo to show off the capabilities of the new controller. And yeah, that's the main point of the game, but it's actually a really awesome game, objectively speaking. It's a 3D platformer that looks and plays incredibly smooth. There's only a few stages, but each and every one of them are designed extremely well. It took me only a few hours to beat the game and get the platinum trophy, but it was a great way to celebrate my purchase of the console. Why won't Sony make more games like this? Well, the truth is, they're working on a new Astrobot game that I'm very excited for. As for this game, it's probably the best tech demo of all time. It's an underrated gem, I'm telling you. Next, we have a game that I have absolutely no clue how I'm going to get footage for, and that's The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Now look, I played through this game earlier this year, and I used 100% original hardware using one of my dad's old CRT TVs, because if you know anything about retro games, they look pretty choppy on modern televisions. And even though I was playing a game from 1998 and using a TV from like 1988, it was still the best gaming experience I've had this year. Everything people say about this game online is absolutely true even to this day. Not only did this game revolutionize video game combat, but it revolutionized video game adventure as well. And that central gimmick of traveling between the future and the past multiple times throughout the game, I know it was kind of similar to the Light World and Dark World from the previous game, but it's still an amazing gameplay feature. Basically everything about this game is great. But you know what's really impressive to me? You know how most RPG games have very slow starts? This game puts you right into the first dungeon 10 minutes into the game. Granted, you have to find a sword and shield first. It's just seriously immaculate game design even for today. However, I do have a couple criticisms. The frame rate is inconsistent in some areas, some of the bosses are not very good, and the water temple is a really cool dungeon, but really suffers from that pause and unpause the game mechanic. So I actually don't think this version of the game is perfect. However, what about the 3DS version? It completely fixes the water temple and the frame rate, but some of the bosses are still not very good, and I still think I prefer the N64 version anyway, mostly for the novelty. This is still a top 3 video game of all time in my opinion. It's really impressive that one of these really early 3D games even came close to being perfect. Moving on to a Wii U game of all things, Super Mario 3D World. Now this might sound confusing, but I actually don't think this is the best 3D Mario game. I think both Galaxy games and Odyssey are better overall games, but at the same time, I just think 3D World is the closest to being perfect because it does everything it sets out to do. It's a perfect 3D Mario multiplayer experience. It's just a very well designed platformer that you can experience with friends. That's what it is, and that's all it ever needed to be. I guess one issue you could point out is some of the stages are reused. That's really the only thing I have to complain about. It's an awesome game, and unfortunately, I don't have much else to say. And once again, if you're confused on why I'm featuring it in the video, while also saying it's not better than the other 3D games, I think the experience of the Galaxy games is just so much better. Yet 3D World is very smooth and solid in comparison. I just wanted to further explain why I chose this game to be in the video, so let's go ahead and move on to the next one. Now, if you've been watching my channel for a while, you know about Hollow Knight already. It's a game that basically revived the Metroidvania genre when it was released in 2017. The Metroidvania genre was a dying breed, living mostly off the contributions of its long-lost ancestors, while getting a couple truly must-play games every few years. Hollow Knight is the best Metroidvania that I have ever played, as it takes the best things about Metroidvanias that came before it and adds modern improvements. Great overall gameplay, phenomenal bosses, unique graphical style, hours upon hours of content, great music, all for the criminally low price of $15. You might remember that I actually made a dedicated video on whether or not Hollow Knight is a perfect game. Honestly, there's just one thing about this game that I think we should all be able to agree on, and that's charms. Charms are different abilities you can equip in order to gain additional effects. Some of the charms in the game are incredible, and some are completely awful. Yep, that's my only semi-big problem with the game. The charms are not balanced well at all, but I mean, there's still definitely room to choose your own favorites. Overall, the game is amazing, but I think it's ever so slightly not perfect. Since we're on the topic of Metroidvanias, let's talk about another one of my favorites, The Messenger. The Messenger is a game I've been talking about on the channel lately because I think its game design is absolutely immaculate. When you begin playing the game, it seems like it's just a ripoff of Ninja Gaiden, but with some modern day improvements like better controls and whatnot. Then you get thrown a curveball, and a few hours into the game, you're in a 16-bit environment now. And when you think the game won't possibly be able to blow you away for a second time, then the game goes from being a linear action platform to a full-blown Metroidvania with tons of secrets to go back and find. And if that sounds boring, trust me, it's not. People usually hate when games make you backtrack, but in The Messenger, it's done so incredibly well because the stages change without actually changing, if that makes any sense. The stages don't change, but the nature of how you play through those stages do change. It's just a remarkable video game that really deserves more credit than it gets. I can see why people are less interested in this game as opposed to Hollow Knight because the game has way less content, but for me, it's not about how long a game takes, it's about how fun it is. In terms of issues, I have one minor issue with The Messenger. The enemies in this game are very, and I mean very, repetitive. The stages do still have their own unique enemies, but there's still repeated enemies in almost every stage, and it just makes them less special. Other than that, what an underrated game The Messenger is. Next up is another all-time classic, Super Mario World. Other than maybe the graphics and controls, this game doesn't really do anything better than Mario 3, but it doesn't do that much worse either. I think the criticism I have of this game is the repetitive environments. It's not the level design itself that's repetitive, it's actually very well designed. It's the fact that there's too many basic green levels, too many similar cave areas, just not enough unique looking areas in my opinion. It makes the atmosphere of this game kinda boring. This is still the second best 2D Mario game, I think. Just not absolutely perfect if you care about the problem I just went over. There's not much else to say other than it's another game that's close to being perfect but just has a mistake thrown in there. The game is almost perfect just like the third game. There's just that one thing I don't like about it, which isn't really a big deal because it doesn't even affect gameplay. One thing I actually do love about the game is the secret exits. They're extremely well done in this game and paved the way for them to bring this feature back in the newer games, so that's definitely something to thank it for. Moving on to the best game of the 2010s, at least in my opinion, Red Dead Redemption 2. Now, I said that the original Red Dead Redemption is my favorite game ever, but what I didn't mention is that it's also due to nostalgia. I played that game with my dad when I was like 6 years old, but I actually think Red Dead Redemption 2 is a better overall game in a lot of ways. The first game has better gameplay as it's more so about arcade gameplay instead of realism, but the second game has a much better story, better characters, better open world, and absolutely way more content. Red Dead Redemption 2 has some of the best moments in any video game story, and is is the reason I think it has the best story out of any game ever. Now, since this game has much more content than the original, that opens the door to more noticeable issues. I don't think this means the game is worse. I just think it has more issues while also having more positives at the same time. The second game just ends up having a much higher ceiling than the original. Some of my issues with it, however, include missable items and missions, ridiculous RNG based challenges. An open world adventure game that's as big as Red Dead 2 is always gonna have a couple nitpicky issues like this. So no surprise there, but the RNG based challenges are the main reason I never want to 100% this game. And that's pretty much it. This game isn't perfect, but still one of the best games ever made. And for the last game of the video, let's talk about Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. This is a video game that I am almost unable to criticize. It's not only the best Donkey Kong Country game, but the best 2D platformer I have ever played. With its phenomenal level design, great bosses, great art style, phenomenal soundtrack, it's just the epitome of a 10 out of 10 video game. And the embarrassing thing is, I almost forgot to even mention it. This is one of those games where if I didn't include it, I'd look like the biggest moron on the planet. This is a video game that you simply need to include in a video like this, assuming you've played it. Since this is a video about discussing issues, I guess I'll bring up one tiny nitpicky thing about the game, and it's about the characters you play as. I think Diddy Kong is not very good in this game, because Dixie Kong has the same ability except way better. I wish Diddy Kong was buffed a bit. Other than that, this game is basically uncriticizable. Still, since the characters aren't completely balanced, it's technically not a perfect video game. Alright, well that was the list. So let's come up with a conclusion before we end the video. Video games can theoretically be perfect. However, due to how extremely complicated they are, it's almost impossible. Sure, games with much smaller scopes can technically have zero issues, but if you're making a huge game with tons of content, weapons, items, characters, it's statistically impossible for you to create a game with legitimately zero issues. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed. If we can reach 500 likes, I might do a part 2, because I'm sure there's a lot more games I could have included. Whether you think I should have included the Mario Galaxy games, or if I should have included more turn-based RPGs, the point of this video is that even games we think are perfect still end up having a few tiny issues here and there, and that's about it. Thanks for watching, everybody.